Welcome back to Upside Down Data. Let's talk about whether or not this Bitcoin breakout is one that we should believe in. So really at the beginning of this year now, as I'm recording this on the 2nd, Bitcoin has already been performing quite well, up 4.5% on the first of the year, and now has broken above the prior highs from 2023, setting in new highs, getting up to almost 26K on this wick here. But the question I want to address is, should we believe this breakout and think that this is just going to be another leg up like we've seen here, for example, or here, or might there be something else in store for us? So I want to look at a variety of data, see what is maybe pointing in that direction of it being a real breakout, and what might be pointing in the opposite direction. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was a model that I've talked about a bit before, bring it out here again, and that is a fair value for Bitcoin based on the DXY. So the DXY is the strength of the dollar relative to a basket of other fiat currencies, and the dollar tends to be inversely correlated with risk assets and Bitcoin. When the dollar is doing well, Bitcoin tends to do poorly. When the dollar does poorly, Bitcoin tends to do well, and that is a pretty strong relationship that existed throughout Bitcoin's history. And so basically what this model does is it takes in as input what is the dollar doing, and then it assesses what a fair value for Bitcoin might be based on what the dollar is doing. We can see it does a good job of giving us an idea of when Bitcoin is overvalued and when Bitcoin is undervalued, like here and here, for example. And so really going into 2023, the beginning of that year, so beginning of 2023, we saw that the fair value for Bitcoin was quite a bit higher than where its price was based on what the DXY was doing. And that was a bullish sign that suggested that Bitcoin might be undervalued here in 2023 relative to what we'd expect based on the DXY. And indeed, we then saw the price of Bitcoin catch up with its DXY based fair value. Now, more recently, it was interesting with the pump that we saw going into the end of last year, we actually got a bit ahead of the DXY based fair value. But now that fair value has caught up, we were staying kind of in lockstep, sort of like we saw back something like through here. This happens often where they kind of go together. And now we actually see the fair value again being higher than the current price. The fair value is up at around 62K right now for Bitcoin, the DXY based fair value, and price is obviously quite a bit below that. So from this data point, you might say, all right, maybe this is a breakout we should believe in. If the fair value for Bitcoin right now, based on what the dollar is doing, is all the way up above 60K, then certainly Bitcoin could have some room to run, even if it doesn't make it all the way up there in this breakout. So that is certainly possible. One thing that's going to be important to keep an eye on, though, is that this is based on what the DXY does, of course. And one of the things that we'll see with what the DXY has been doing recently is that it came down and tested this support level that was support back here in February of 23, again here in April of 23, and also kind of throughout April and May here. And then also, again, we bounced off of it just in December of last year. And now it seems like we're bouncing off it relatively strongly. So this is something I think is worth keeping an eye on. That if this turns into a stronger move to the upside like we've seen before, that could lead the DXY up higher, which actually might change what this fair value might be. It might come down a bit, like we saw here, for example, coming back down, and might meet price. And it might either be that price moves up a bit more and this moves down to it. Any kind of different combination could happen. But I'm not saying that 62K number is static. It's not. It's a dynamic level based on what the DXY is doing. So that's where we currently stand. But we saw a massive rally in the DXY that would probably change this model's view. And that might suggest that Bitcoin is not quite as undervalued as it would look right now. So something to keep an eye on. But certainly where we sit right now, this is a sign that maybe a further breakout, even if not all the way up to something like 62K, could be in the cards. All right, so that's one thing we can keep an eye on. There are other things that I think are worth looking at as well, though. So another data point suggesting that maybe this is a breakout we should believe in is our forecast model. So this model gives us the probability that the price of Bitcoin will be higher than where it is right now, 6 months in the future. So the output here is probability. So when you're up at, for example, 0.97, that's saying there's a 97% chance that the price of Bitcoin will be above where it is right now, 6 months in the future. And then likewise, when you're all the way down at, for example, 0.04, that's only a 4% chance it'll be up from where it is right now, 6 months in the future. And the model does a really good job of capturing these market dynamics. When are you in a bullish phase? When are you in a bearish phase? And it has accurately identified going into 2023 very well that this was a bullish phase for the market. Indeed, that's exactly what we saw. 2023 was a very bullish year for Bitcoin, at least way more bullish than a lot of people thought it was going to be going into 2023. And the forecast model remains bullish. We're up here at around 94% chance of upside 6 months in the future from the model's estimate. And so that is another sign that being bullish is a reasonable base case right now. You'd much rather this be up at 94 or 0.94 than all the way down, for example, at 0.04, like for example it was here, and then that led into this horrible continuation of the bear market down through here. So that is certainly a positive sign, but of course it's also useful to mention that even in these times where the forecast model is super bullish, that doesn't mean that you can't have notable substantial drawdowns in price, substantial corrections. We've seen that many different times. Even when the market overall is bullish, you can have notable corrections happen at that time. And so it wouldn't shock me if that were to happen here again. And so that's where with the forecast model, it says the overall medium to longer term view remains bullish. But if we're talking about the specific breakout, maybe this is just a continuation of that trend and just continuation of that bullishness. But it could also be that this could lead to a correction, go down further, and then go up, which would still be entirely consistent with the forecast model remaining super bullish. So that is something that's important to keep in mind. And so that's where I want to flip now to signs that might suggest that this breakout might be limited in what it's able to accomplish. So one of the things we can look at is where is risk for Bitcoin right now? And I'm showing you here the long-term upside downside potential indicator. It's a model that we have on our website, partydigital.io, link in the description. And basically what this gets at is risk in the market. So high values mean high risk, low values mean low risk. And what you can see right now is that we got to a relatively elevated level up above 1. And these are levels that Bitcoin does not hit often at all. Really only a few times in its history, either when it's going off to all-time highs or putting in a notable mid-cycle top, does it tend to hit these types of levels. And so I talked about that before, where if we were just going to go ripping off to all-time highs, we probably want to see that soon. If we were going to think that getting this level was going to give rise to that, if it's going to look at anything like these past times, we want to see some notable continuation. So maybe that's what this is with this breakout, and we're going to go charting off that way. But I think it's also very possible, and I personally think it's a little bit more likely, that we're going to do something more like some of these ones here, where even if it's not a super deep correction or a long-lasting correction, some kind of a correction would make sense from these levels. And again, that would still be consistent with this bullish view, longer to medium term of Bitcoin, like for the forecast model saying, we can have a notable correction while still be on the course for moving up. And so in some ways, the shorter term outlook isn't all that important. If we get a correction, if we don't, if the overall outlook is bullish, then in some ways, who cares? Obviously, this isn't financial advice. I personally am not panic selling Bitcoin, or wouldn't do so if we did get a correction here, but it wouldn't shock me. And that's where I think it's useful just to be prepared that if we did get a correction, I think a lot of people might get scared. And then especially if it was a relatively deep correction or a pretty strong, even if it's short lasting, a lot of people might get shaken out of their positions. But just know that can happen, that this would not be an abnormal behavior. And really when we see notable rallies for Bitcoin, we tend to see them start out of negative values. You just look back in the past, the runs up to all-time highs, even coming off of corrections, all started from negative values. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all if Bitcoin needs to either slow down, consolidate here, even correct, like long-term risk cool down further, back down into the negatives to then set some bottom to then have it go back up to the upside. So that would be totally consistent with what we've seen in the past, would not be surprising to me at all. Another thing we can look at is our momentum bias indicator, or MBI. So this captures the prevailing momentum in the market. So positive values be positive momentum bias, negative values, negative momentum bias. This is a Z-score, so 0 is actually the average amount of momentum in the market, which for Bitcoin is, of course, up. And then these are standard deviation units above and below. And what you tend to see with Bitcoin and other assets as well is that there are distinct phases, or distinct behaviors you'll see in the MBI at different parts of the market cycle. So in a bull market, you'll spend a lot more time in the green than in the red. You'll just kind of blast off into the green, spend a ton of time up there until eventually things have to cool off and you'll have a notable correction. And then in a bear market, you'll spend a lot of time in the red with maybe brief attempts to reestablish positive momentum that fail, move down to the downside. See this every single time. But then notably, and where it looks like we are right now, is this kind of oscillating around 0 type of behavior that it tends to do in the transitions out of bear markets into early stage bull markets. Coming out of a bear market, and look what we've been doing, oscillating around zero. And so it wouldn't surprise me again if we do like we did back in here, if we have to come back down and dip back down below zero again, and that often corresponds with a correction in price. We're trending down on the NBI right now, would not surprise me if we come down into the negatives again, and that would be entirely consistent with what we'd expect at this phase of the market cycle. That assuming we really are in an early bull market, which the data seem to point to the fact that we are, or to the idea that we are, then that would be totally expected. There might be fear in the market at that point, but really this would just be an expected dynamic. Price doesn't go up straight up forever. You expect corrections to happen at some point. This would be relatively expected. Now, it wouldn't have to happen. We could do something like back through here, for example, and just bounce back to the upside and continue ripping up. But I think it's probably the case, or if I had to basically choose a side, I would suspect it's more likely that we're going to dip our toes below zero here than just shoot off. Love to be wrong about that. Love for Bitcoin to just rip off to all-time highs from here. But I think that's probably the more likely outcome just from what we've seen. I personally am not in the camp that thinks that Bitcoin is just going to be able to rip off to the upside without any problems and go to new all-time highs within the next few months. Another thing we can look at that also is a bit of a cautious potential sign here is what is sentiment doing in the markets? This is social sentiment. Are people overall bullish or bearish on the market? So this is a new model I've been playing around with. It's still experimental at this point, but I just like to give some previews of it. This is a model that I created that takes in a bunch of social media data from a bunch of different platforms, and it analyzes what people are actually saying. And are they saying things that are consistent with a bullish narrative for crypto, so this is the whole market here, or bearish things for crypto? And what you can see is that people oftentimes get it wrong. When you get these extreme spikes in sentiment, which is basically everyone getting bullish or predominantly bullish, then that tends to correspond with notable tops or at least corrections in price. Tend to see that. And likewise, these bottoming points tend to mark notable bottoms in crypto prices. And so what we're seeing is that the sentiment is again rocketing up to the upside, getting close to where we were back here before we had a notable correction. And really before, it took us a while before we actually broke out of that range that we more or less established through this time. And so again, it wouldn't surprise me if people are getting a little bit too euphoric here. We've seen altcoins really start to pop off. Of course, Bitcoin's done very well. A lot of meme coins have been going crazy. That the market's getting to that point where people might be getting a little bit too exuberant, a little bit too eager to just jump in on the long side, that we might need to let things cool off. People get more bearish. People maybe start shorting the market to give fuel for that short squeeze to catalyze the next leg up. It tends to be the case in markets that price will move against the majority when the majority is getting relatively extreme. So I don't think we're super extreme yet, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me at all if we're getting to a point where in this phase of the market cycle, we're getting a little bit too exuberant and we might expect some kind of a correction before we can start moving back up again. Some other things I think are going to be important to watch as well beyond this is just looking at broader markets. The stock market has gapped down here. We'll have to see if there's a continuation of this throughout the day and really throughout the week of this, but certainly if the stock market starts to fall off, that would probably not be a great sign for crypto. Crypto hasn't been perfectly correlated with the stock market by any means over the last year, but still you'd rather have a rising stock market in the case of crypto than a falling stock market. So we'll have to keep an eye on what the major stock indices do there. Then as I mentioned before, the beginning, see what the DXY does. We'd like to see this bounce, fade or fail to give more tailwinds for risk assets. So I think there are data points that can be pointed on different sides. And ultimately, I think that if the long-term data is bullish in some ways, these shorter-term considerations of is this the breakout or not don't really matter. But I think what is useful about this is just framing our expectations that when we get into this kind of period where it seems like prices are more or less just going up only, not just for Bitcoin, but for altcoins and other ones, that when you see a break of that and suddenly notable corrections form, a lot of panic can come in. People saying, oh, I guess it's over. You know, the recession's coming or whatever the narrative would be that would dominate at that time. And then a lot of people will panic, maybe dump their positions and leave. But if the long-term data is bullish, then those would likely just be opportunities. So of course, not financial advice, you should make your own opinions, but that's what I'm looking for. That would not surprise me at all if we see a short to medium term correction from here, but really that might just be in service of a broader bull market for Bitcoin and frankly for the rest of the crypto market. Talked about this before. Look at 2017, often regarded as one of the most beautiful looking bull markets that we've had for Bitcoin, but just look at the massive corrections we had along the way. That is totally normal, totally expected, and would not shock me at all with Bitcoin having been pretty much up only ever since really September 2023 to have some more notable correction at some point. Who knows how deep it has to go, who knows how long it has to go, but something like that forming would make sense. Now, again, I'd love to be wrong and for this to be something that just clears us off to all-time highs, but I think we should just be grounded in what we might expect and not let our emotions dictate that. There's a lot of data pointing to the idea that a correction would make sense here, but the long-term data remains bullish. And so to keep ourselves grounded, ignore the emotion, ignore the narratives, ignore the people on X who are just going to be going with whatever the shortest term price movement has been in what their bias on the market is, and get a more objective evaluation of the market. All right, if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on X. A lot of updates about our models and more over there. And go to our website, partydigital.io, link in the description. Find live data from our models and more over there.